Alexander Harrington, 35 years old, a successful tech billionaire, cold and disbelieving in love. To him, everything revolves around power and money. A man standing at the peak of fame, owning what others desire, yet showing no interest in intangible things like emotions or family responsibilities. He believes everything in life can be bought, including loyalty and respect. That night, on the glamorous streets of Manhattan, Alexander drove his Lamborghini Aventador through the brightly lit streets. His mind was focused on an important business deal, but in a moment, everything was interrupted. When he stopped at an intersection, his eyes accidentally caught a scene that made his heart skip a beat. Across the street, a woman was holding the hands of 4 children crossing the road. But what left Alexander stunned wasn't their presence, but their faces. They resembled him remarkably. His heart involuntarily beat faster. This similarity could not be a coincidence. A strange feeling, a mixture of curiosity and shock, flooded him. Never before had Alexander felt so out of control. A man like him, who lived by reason and logic, suddenly found himself swept up in something he couldn't explain. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes never leaving the woman and the children. She had a delicate but strong appearance, with thick black hair framing a sharp face. Her brown eyes gleamed with caution, but also contained a deep sorrow. Isabella Rodriguez, a single mother, resilient and mysterious. She wasn't like the women he had encountered before. No flashy appearance, no desire for attention, yet exuding a strength that made others unable to look away. Without hesitation, Alexander immediately turned the car and blocked her path. Isabella stopped, instinctively shielding the children behind her. Her eyes darkened when she saw the stranger stepping out of the luxury car. She didn't know who he was, but his gaze, cold and determined, made her feel danger. The 4 children huddled close to her, holding her hand tightly as if they sensed the tense atmosphere. Alexander stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Who are you?" Isabella clenched her fists, maintaining her composure. "I don't think we know each other." He didn't pay attention to the evasive answer. His eyes were fixed on the children. They had sharp eyes like his, high noses, and their facial features were strikingly similar to his miniature version. There was no doubt about it. These children were related to him in some way. What about the children? He crossed his arms over his chest, his voice firm. "They look very much like me." Isabella took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew this moment would come sooner or later, but she never expected it to unfold this way. "You're mistaken," she replied succinctly. Alexander narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to being denied or having questions avoided. "Really?" He took a step forward, but immediately stopped when he saw the children shrink back, their eyes full of fear. A strange feeling overtook his mind. He wasn't the type to care about other people's emotions, but seeing the children react like this made him hesitate. Isabella stood her ground, her gaze resolute. She wasn't the type to be intimidated, but in that moment, she realized that the man in front of her wasn't someone who would give up easily. Finally, after a few seconds of tense silence, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "They have no father. They only have me." Those words struck Alexander like a sharp knife. He had never felt so out of control. The truth was right in front of him, but this woman was deliberately hiding it. Did she think she could hide it from him? No one could refuse Alexander Harrington. He stared directly into her eyes, each word coming out with certainty. "They have a father, and their father is me." Isabella froze. For a moment, confusion flickered in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by firmness. The 4 children stared blankly at their mother, as if waiting for an answer. They were too young to understand the complexity of the situation, but they could sense the tension in the air between the 2 adults. Alexander didn't take his eyes off Isabella. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. He had found a mystery in his life, and he was determined to unravel it. Whether she liked it or not, he wasn't leaving until he had his answers. Alexander stood before Isabella, his gaze cold, but his heart stirred. She was lying. He knew it. The resemblance between him and the children was undeniable. They couldn't be anyone else's kids. Isabella looked at him, her deep brown eyes flashing with caution and determination. She clenched her fists, as if reminding herself not to waver before this man. "They have no father, only me," Isabella replied coldly. Alexander removed his sunglasses, his eyes locking onto the children. They stood close to their mother, gazing at him with innocent eyes. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. Those eyes looked eerily like his. They couldn't be without a father. They had one, and that person was him. "They have a father." His voice was low but firm, each word coming out like an order. "And their father is me." Isabella held her breath. Her heart tightened as the truth was laid bare before her. She knew she couldn't deny it forever, but she couldn't let Alexander just waltz into her children's lives so easily. She had raised them alone, devoted her life to protecting them from harm. She couldn't let a stranger, even if he was their biological father, disrupt everything. But Alexander was not someone who gave up easily. Once he suspected something, he was determined to uncover the truth. And now, he stood before the clearest answer he had ever received. An unexpected turning point came when the past suddenly rushed back into Alexander's mind. He recalled a crucial decision made many years ago. At the time, he was young, ambitious, but also had gone through a financial crisis. One of the swift decisions he made to earn some extra money was to donate sperm to a high-end fertility bank. It was just one of those simple transactions with no strings attached, and he had never thought it would affect his life one day. Isabella also remembered her own painful memories. She had once loved a man whom she believed would be by her side forever, but when she found out she couldn't conceive naturally, he abandoned her without a second thought. She fell into despair, but decided not to give up on her dream of becoming a mother. With the help of a fertility clinic, she underwent artificial insemination without the need for a man by her side. And now, fate had ironically placed her face to face with the biological father of her children, a man she never thought would show up in their lives. Two people, two fates that seemed unrelated, yet destiny had bound them together in an unexpected way. Alexander stood frozen in disbelief. He looked at Isabella, then at the children. A strange feeling overwhelmed him. This was not a transaction, not a negotiation. This was real life, and for the first time, he was facing something beyond his control. Isabella didn't know what to do either. She had thought she could live peacefully with her children, that she didn't need a father figure in their lives. But now, Alexander knew, and he was not the type of man who would leave without reclaiming what was his. He could not ignore this truth. From the moment he realized that the 4 children could be his mind had been consumed with the question of the connection between him and Isabella. This was no longer a mere coincidence. If these children truly carried his blood, he needed to know everything. And Alexander Harrington had never been one to stand outside of anything that concerned him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his cold gaze directed straight at Isabella. She was confused, he could tell, but Alexander knew that there was only one way to bring the truth to light. "Get in the car." His voice was deep but firm. "I need you to help me with something. This is a matter of life and death." Isabella froze. For a moment, she was going to refuse, but Alexander's gaze left her no choice. She turned to look at the children, her heart tightening. She knew that no matter how much she tried to avoid it, this man would not stop. She could not let things get any worse. And above all, she needed to ensure the safety of her children. She took a deep breath, then slowly nodded. Just for a moment, inside the car, the atmosphere fell into silence. The sound of the Lamborghini engine rumbled softly on the long road. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, her hand unconsciously gripping the hem of her coat. She could feel Alexander's eyes watching her. Nothing escaped his attention. "What are you hiding from me?" He spoke first. Isabella clenched her hands, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "I have nothing to hide." Alexander smirked, but it was not a friendly smile. "Do you really think I will believe that?" She didn't answer. Her breath grew heavier, as if she were fighting with herself. She had kept this secret for so long, and now there was no turning back. "They are my children, aren't they?" Alexander asked bluntly. The The air inside the car suddenly felt suffocating. Isabella didn't know how to respond. She had promised herself she would never let Alexander into her children's lives. But now, the truth was slowly being exposed. She knew she could not hide it forever. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice soft but resolute. Alexander did not blink. "I want to know the truth." A sigh escaped Isabella's lips. She knew the time had come to tell everything. "I was married," she began, her voice lowering. "I loved him with all my heart. But when I found out I couldn't have children naturally, he left me. To him, a woman who couldn't bear children was useless." Alexander remained silent, but his eyes were sharper than ever. He did not interrupt, allowing her to continue. "I didn't give up," Isabella continued. "I went to a fertility clinic. I decided to be a single mother, and I chose sperm from a sperm bank." She turned to look at him, her gaze challenging. "Do you understand what I mean?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. A sudden rush of memories flooded his mind. Years ago, during a brief period of his life, he had made a decision he never thought would have any consequences. He had once donated sperm. "You chose me," he said slowly, almost as if confirming it to himself. Isabella pressed her lips together. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Alexander leaned toward her, his gaze sharp. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" She chuckled softly, but it was a sad laugh. "I didn't need a father for my children. I just wanted them to have a happy life. And you're not the kind of man who can provide that." Her words left Alexander stunned. No one had ever said this to him before. No one had ever thought he wasn't good enough. But Isabella wasn't a woman to be easily swayed. She had raised 4 children on her own, protected them, sheltered them from this cruel world, and she believed Alexander had no place in that world. But he wasn't one to give up easily. "You think you can decide everything on your own?" His voice deepened, full of danger. "They are my children too. You can't hide them from me." Isabella turned to look him straight in the eye. "I don't want to hide them. I just want to protect them." For the first time in his life, Alexander felt a strange sensation he could not describe. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions. But with Isabella and the children, everything was no longer so simple. Those 4 children carried his blood, whether he liked it or not. And Isabella, she wasn't just the mother of his children. She was a strong, resilient woman, willing to fight to protect what she loved. On the long road ahead, Alexander knew he would not back down easily. This was not just about honor, power, or a hidden truth. It was about something much bigger, a family he never thought he would have. Their confrontation was not over. It had only just begun. Alexander drove along the tree-lined road leading to the Harrington estate. The atmosphere was quiet. Only the sound of the wheels rolling over the stone-paved road could be heard. Isabella sat beside him, her eyes filled with worry, her hands unconsciously gripping the hem of her jacket as she looked up at the grand building ahead. It was not just a lavish mansion, but also a symbol of power, lineage, and things she had never wanted to face. The 4 children sat in the back, curiously observing everything through the wide glass windows. They had no idea that in just a moment, their lives could change forever. The heavy iron gate slowly opened, and 2 rows of guards stood at attention, bowing their heads as Alexander drove in. An elderly butler waited at the top of the stairs, his face unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a slight surprise when he saw the children step out with Isabella. Alexander's grandmother was waiting for them in the largest room of the mansion, where soft light filtered through the tall windows. She had once been the absolute matriarch of the Harrington family, a woman who was tough and cold, but also the one Alexander respected the most. Grandmother Harrington sat in an intricately carved mahogany armchair, her face calm but full of authority. When Isabella entered with the 4 children, the room seemed to fall silent for a few seconds. Her gaze shifted from Alexander to Isabella, then paused on the children. A momentary flicker of confusion crossed her aged face, but then another emotion surged, an emotion so rare that no one had ever expected to see it on her face. "They are," she whispered, but her voice quickly faltered. The children looked at her with curiosity. They didn't quite understand who this woman was, But there was something in her eyes that made them feel strangely familiar. Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "They are the bloodline of the Harrington family." Alexander's grandmother shuddered slightly. She had lived long enough to understand certain undeniable truths. She examined each of the children carefully, studying every feature on their faces, and then tears began to fall. A woman like her, who had always maintained a hard exterior through all adversity, could not stop the tears when faced with these grandchildren she had never known. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her legs frail with age, but her gaze still held the same regal authority. "Come here, children," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The children looked at their mother, as if waiting for permission. Isabella hesitated, but when she saw the slight nod from the old woman, she gently pushed them forward. Alexander's grandmother knelt down, arms outstretched to embrace them, as if trying to feel every bit of their existence. "They are the blood of the family, the hope of mine." Her words echoed through the quiet room, filled with both emotion and determination. Isabella could feel warmth spreading through the room, a warmth she never thought she would find here. She had always thought of the Harrington family as a cold, power-driven entity that only cared about wealth and influence. But now, seeing Alexander's grandmother embrace her children, feeling the warmth of family love, she knew she had been wrong. No matter who Alexander was, no matter how much power and ambition he had, the family blood in him was something undeniable. Alexander's grandmother looked up, her eyes red, but filled with intense resolve. "You must bring them here, Alexander. This is where they belong." Her voice was not negotiable, it was an order. Isabella stood frozen. She never imagined she would hear such words. She could not deny the sincerity in her voice, but she also couldn't easily let her children become part of a family she didn't fully understand. She turned to Alexander, searching for an answer in his eyes. Alexander stood still, but in his mind, a fierce battle raged. He had never thought about having a family, never imagined that one day he would face a situation like this. But as he looked at the children, at Isabella, and at his grandmother, the woman who had taught him everything about strength and responsibility, he knew this was not a choice he could avoid. "We need time," Isabella said, breaking the silence. "I can't make a decision right away." Alexander's grandmother nodded. "I don't expect you to decide immediately, but I want you to understand that this family will always welcome your children." She turned to Alexander, her voice becoming more resolute. "You can do as you wish with your life, Alexander, but I will not allow you to deny your responsibility toward these children." Alexander clenched his fist, his eyes flashing with an emotion he didn't even recognize. Responsibility, a word he had always associated with work and power, was something he had never thought would relate to family. But now, it had become an inescapable part of his life. Isabella looked around the room, then sighed softly. She knew this was no longer just her story. This was the story of a family she never imagined she would become a part of. But the only thing that mattered to her was still her children. She would not let anything harm them. Alexander's grandmother placed her hand on Isabella's shoulder, her eyes lowering but filled with sincerity. "Stay in the mansion for a while, both you and the children. Let them have the chance to understand this family, and let you understand that we are not enemies." Isabella hesitated. Was this the right decision? But as she saw the expectant gaze of the children, the sincerity in the old woman's words, and the thoughtful silence from Alexander, she knew she could not just think of herself. She slowly nodded. "We'll stay, but only for a short time." Alexander's grandmother smiled, a rare smile that perhaps only a few had ever seen. "Thank you, Isabella. I promise you, you will not regret this decision." The large room became warmer than ever before. A new chapter of their lives had just begun, though no one knew what would happen next. Harrington Mansion was bathed in the brilliant glow of the setting sun, the last rays of the day streaming through the large windows, creating a peaceful scene that seemed unbreakable. But in an instant, that peace was shattered by the sharp sound of high heels clacking on the marble floor. The front door burst open, and a woman entered, her long, curly hair flowing, her face perfectly made up, but her eyes full of fury. Emilia Mendez Ortiz, the famous fashion designer and fiancée of Alexander Harrington, stood in the center of the grand hall of the mansion, her demeanor proud and powerful. She had heard the news, a news that made her blood boil with anger. Alexander had brought another woman and her 4 children into his home, and not just brought them in, but had allowed them to appear openly in his life. Alexander's grandmother stood on the staircase, her gaze calm yet sharp in its scrutiny. Isabella had just returned from the garden with the 4 children when she faced Emilia. She froze when she met the angry gaze of the unfamiliar woman. The children sensed the tense atmosphere and immediately grabbed their mother's hand, huddling close to her. Emilia walked straight toward Isabella, her voice as sharp as a knife. "Who are you, and why are you here?" Isabella calmly replied, showing no sign of hesitation despite the provocation. "I am the mother of these 4 children." Emilia raised an eyebrow, a sneer forming on her lips. "Their mother? And you think that just by that title, you can walk into this house as if you belong here? Do you think Alexander will accept a woman like you just because you have children with him?" Isabella held her gaze firmly, her voice low but certain. "They are Alexander's children." These words struck Emilia like a direct punch. Her face stiffened. Then in an instant, she burst into derisive laughter. "You really think you can use this to cling to Alexander? How laughable. You're just a low-class gold digger." Alexander appeared at that moment, his gaze cold as he heard Emilia's words. He stepped forward, placing himself between the 2 women, his voice lowering in a warning. "That's enough, Emilia." Emilia turned to look at Alexander, her eyes filled with hurt, but also mixed with anger. "What the hell are you doing? Alexander, do you really believe what she's saying? Do you think she doesn't have an ulterior motive? Suddenly showing up with 4 children and claiming they're yours? This is a cheap scam." Alexander clenched his fists. The inner conflict inside him grew more intense. On one side, there was honor, his long-term relationship with Emilia, who had stood by him for many years. On the other, the undeniable reality. The 4 children were his blood, and Isabella, the woman who showed no signs of seeking any gain from him. Alexander's grandmother spoke up, her voice not loud but full of authority. "Emilia, I think you should learn to behave appropriately. This is not something you have the right to decide." Emilia bit her lip, her hand gripping so tightly that her nails almost dug into her skin. She couldn't believe that even Alexander's grandmother was siding with Isabella. She had been Alexander's fiancée for so long, the one who always stood by him at every event, the one everyone thought would be the future Mrs. Harrington. And now, an unknown woman appears, bringing 4 children, and immediately takes center stage in Alexander's life? No, she could not accept this. She looked at Alexander, her voice full of pain but also firm. "Tell me, Alexander, me or her? Who are you choosing?" The entire room fell silent. Alexander knew that this was not an easy question to answer. Before Isabella appeared, he never imagined he would have to face such a choice. But now, everything had changed. He looked toward Isabella, who was holding the children tightly, her face calm, but her eyes still filled with caution. Then he looked at Emilia, the woman who had been with him through many years, but had never made him feel a true connection. Finally, he sighed, his voice low but clear. "Emilia, this is no longer your matter." Those words struck Emilia like a knife straight into her heart. She froze, unable to believe her ears. What are you saying? You really choose her? You choose a woman with no background over me?" Alexander didn't answer, because even he didn't know if this was a choice, or simply a truth he could no longer deny. Emilia stepped back, tears welling in her eyes but not falling. She had lost, and she knew it. But she was not the type to give up easily. She looked at Isabella, her eyes filled with hatred. "You will pay for this. I won't let you take everything from me." With that, she turned and left, leaving a heavy atmosphere in the room. Isabella took a deep breath, not knowing that the real storm had only just begun. And Alexander, for the first time in his life, felt that his decision would change everything. In the quiet space of the Harrington estate, Alexander's grandmother, who had always been the family's steadfast pillar, sat across from him, her gaze resolute. She knew everything, but now, she was no longer keeping any secrets. Her words were like a thunderbolt to Alexander, making him unable to believe what he had just heard. "Alexander, did you forget that you were sterilized 3 years ago?" Her voice was calm, but it felt like an undeniable accusation. Immediately, everything in Alexander's mind seemed to shatter. He stood frozen, unable to believe the words that had just come from her. He had forgotten that 3 years ago, during a difficult time, he made the decision to protect himself from unforeseen risks. He hadn't thought that it would affect his life later on. Now, with everything exposed, Alexander didn't know how to face this truth. Amelia stood beside him, her eyes wide, speechless and stunned. It was only now that she realized she had been deceived. She had thought that her relationship with Alexander would be forever, that he would always be by her side until these children appeared. But now, this truth was a slap in the face to everything she had once believed. Amelia was numb, feeling as if all her strength suddenly vanished. She couldn't comprehend that she had lived with a lie all this time. She couldn't accept the truth that Alexander couldn't have children, and everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed for this relationship, now seemed meaningless. Alexander turned to Amelia, but found no words to explain. The lies she had woven all this time were now exposed. She wasn't just his lover. She was the one who wanted to seize his life, gradually cutting ties with his family, with all the real values. She wanted everything to belong to her, but she hadn't taken into account one important thing. Not everything in life can be bought, not even love and loyalty. Seeing Amelia's expression, Alexander felt a turmoil within him. His feelings for her had completely changed, even though he didn't want to admit it. Before him now was a woman filled with hatred and anger. But what made him feel pity was that Amelia had created a false world to live in. He could no longer love someone like that. He had seen the honesty, the strength of Isabella and the children, and he knew he couldn't continue in a relationship that had drained all emotions. Alexander's grandmother sat silently, observing both of their actions. She had lived long enough to understand that life doesn't always go as planned. In a large family like the Harringtons, there were many things that had to be kept secret, but not every truth could be buried forever. "Amelia," the grandmother said, her voice firm and full of authority, "I can no longer accept you like this. You've chosen the wrong path." Her words didn't need to be loud. They were enough to silence everyone in the room. Amelia looked at her, her eyes beginning to well up with tears, but she didn't let them fall. This defeat was too bitter. She had thought that she could change everything, but now she realized it was too late. "You can't choose her," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am the one who deserves you." Alexander didn't respond because he knew this wasn't a choice he wanted to make. He looked toward Isabella, the woman he had once viewed as a stranger, but now she was standing beside him, protecting the children and himself. She wasn't just the mother of the children. She was the one who had proven that everything she did came from the heart, not from calculation. Alexander looked back at Amelia, a wave of guilt and disgust rising within him. He could no longer continue in a relationship without honesty. He turned to his grandmother, his gaze resolute. "You're right. I can't continue living this lie. I'm ending everything with Amelia." Amelia stood in shock, unable to believe her ears. What are you saying?" She collapsed, unable to bear the shock. "You can't just abandon me like this." "No, Amelia," Alexander said. "You are no longer important in my life." The grandmother nodded, her gaze sweeping over both of them, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. "We need to look toward the future. Isabella and the children are the legitimate heirs of the Harrington family." Her words were an undeniable declaration. Amelia couldn't protest, couldn't do anything but leave in defeat. She turned and left the mansion without saying another word. A chapter in her life closed, but for Alexander, a new chapter had just begun. As Amelia disappeared from view, Alexander stood still, looking at the children, then at Isabella. The emptiness inside him was gone, replaced by a peace he had never known. And now, he understood that sometimes the truth isn't just about accepting it. It's about choosing to live with it and creating a new future. The grandmother looked at Alexander and Isabella, a smile briefly crossing her lips. "We can begin again. Let us step into the future with the right decisions." In the following days, Alexander began to feel a noticeable change within himself. His heart no longer beat solely for money and power like before. He realized that, although he had never considered becoming a father, these children had entered his life and gradually claimed a piece of his heart. At first, his gestures were merely patience, simple attention towards the children. But then his feelings grew deeper. He started spending more time with the children. Every day, he played with them, taught them new things and life lessons. Alexander never expected that a father's love would come so easily and naturally, even though he wasn't prepared for it. However, the love Alexander had for the children was still a slow process. He could feel his emotions growing, but it wasn't strong enough. Not enough for him to face the truth about his family. He wasn't just a caregiver. He also wanted to protect and love these children as a real father would. Every morning, when they ran to hug him and say good morning, he realized that, despite not wanting it, he could no longer imagine living without them. As for Isabella, she still kept her distance emotionally, even though she had seen the changes in Alexander. At first, Isabella didn't want to let her heart get too close to him. She wasn't easily open after all the pain in her past. She had been hurt by false relationships and ulterior motives. But when she saw how Alexander treated the children, she realized he wasn't the man she had imagined, though he never said it. His sincerity and dedication made her unable to ignore the emotions it stirred in her. One evening, when the warm yellow lights illuminated the large living room of the mansion, Isabella sat by the children's bed. She softly sang lullabies to them, her voice warm and melodic. The traditional songs, the lullabies, made the room feel peaceful and cozy. Meanwhile, Alexander stood outside the door, his gaze fixed on her and the children. He stood in silence, not wanting to interrupt this moment. He listened to every word of Isabella's song, feeling the boundless love she had for the children. Alexander's heart stirred. This was the first time he had truly been moved by a woman. It wasn't a passionate love as he had once imagined, but a feeling of peace, a warmth he had never felt before. He looked at Isabella, and in that moment, he understood that she wasn't just the mother of his children, but the woman he could love. He no longer saw her as a stranger, but as a part of his life. Isabella didn't know that he was standing outside the door. She continued singing to put the children to sleep. She looked at them with a tender gaze, and in her heart, there was a feeling of happiness overwhelming her. Although she hadn't easily opened her heart, she also realized that she was gradually loving these children as if they were her own. And in that moment, when she saw Alexander standing outside the door, she felt a change. She understood that he was no longer the cold, distant man she had once thought. He was gradually becoming a part of this family. Alexander stood there, not saying a word, simply observing quietly. He didn't know if he had the courage to step in and tell Isabella what was on his heart. But one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave her or these children anymore. His life had changed since they arrived. He had found a new purpose in life, and it was this family. In that moment, as Isabella continued singing the lullaby to the children, Alexander felt the peace in his heart. Love wasn't about grand gestures, but about simple moments, sincere actions, and sometimes the small sounds like the lullaby of a mother. He understood that love was a deep connection, emotions nurtured over time. Isabella didn't know that Alexander had quietly listened to her sing, but when she turned around, their eyes met. She didn't say anything, but they understood each other. It was a moment of silence, but full of meaning. They both knew that this love was slowly blossoming, even though it couldn't be named immediately. But from that moment on, they understood that a real family would be built from the simplest and most sincere things. The storm Amelia had stirred up in the Harrington family had never truly subsided. Despite being expelled by Alexander's grandmother, and though everything seemed to have settled, she still wouldn't give up. Amelia was not someone who easily accepted defeat. She always knew how to plot and scheme to get what she wanted. And when she saw Alexander and Isabella building a new life together, a surge of anger and an inability to accept failure rose within her. She could not let another woman take everything she had fought for all this time. The years she had spent with Alexander were not enough for her to realize that, in the end, his love was not for her. And now, she was determined to do whatever it took to destroy their happiness. She would not accept that Alexander had chosen Isabella and the children. But Amelia didn't know that the truth could not always remain hidden forever. She had relied on lies and fabricated evidence to deceive everyone, but the truth always found a way to emerge. With her sharpness, Isabella uncovered Amelia's plot. The traces Amelia left behind could not escape Isabella's notice. She knew that if she didn't act, everything would return to the starting point, where Amelia could hurt everyone. Isabella decided she had to confront Amelia one last time. She couldn't let her continue to destroy this family, especially now that everything had finally settled. She told Alexander about what Amelia was doing, the schemes she was planning. Alexander, though somewhat surprised, did not hesitate to confront Amelia again. He couldn't let her continue to exist in his life. He didn't want this family to endure any more chaos. When everything became clear, Alexander's grandmother, who had always been the strong pillar of the family, intervened. She was someone who never hesitated when making decisions, and this time was no different. She had seen enough, and she knew she couldn't let Amelia continue to affect the family. She spoke up, her voice cold and commanding. "Amelia, you no longer have a place in this family. Everything you've done has been destruction. You do not deserve to stay." Her declaration was an undeniable conclusion. Amelia stood frozen, unable to believe what she had just heard. She had once been the closest person to Alexander, but now, everything had changed. She couldn't understand why everything had to end like this. She didn't want to accept the truth that Alexander's grandmother had rejected her so decisively. "Amelia," the grandmother continued, "I have seen everything you've done. You have exploited this family, and now I will not let you harm them anymore. You have no right to stay here." The grandmother spoke without hesitation. She had destroyed too much, and now nothing could be fixed. Amelia, with no words left to argue, stood in silence. The grandmother's words felt like an irreversible judgment. She felt as though her heart was being crushed. She thought she could change everything, but now it was too late. There was nothing she could do except leave. The feeling of failure weighed heavily on her, making it impossible for her to stand firm. She turned her back and walked out of the mansion in silence. Each step she took felt like the sound of a bell signaling her defeat, her loss in this battle. She had no other choice. Everything she had done now seemed like meaningless games, because Alexander no longer loved her. Isabella watched Amelia leave. She didn't feel victorious or happy. She only felt relief. Facing Amelia one last time, she had won. Not with hatred, but with resilience and love for this family. Alexander stood beside her, his eyes filled with determination. He understood that, in the end, this family was the most important thing. Alexander's grandmother looked at the two of them, saying nothing, but her gaze was full of satisfaction. She knew that everything had been resolved, and the Harrington family would never allow someone like Amelia to interfere in their lives again. At that moment, the grandmother turned to Alexander and Isabella, and with a rare smile, she said, "Finally, our family is back where it belongs. You and the children are the legitimate heirs of the Harrington family." Isabella didn't say anything, just tightly held Alexander's hand. She knew that, despite all the challenges they had faced, this family had truly become her home. She no longer feared. She and Alexander, along with the 4 children, had formed a family that nothing could break. Finally, after all the challenges and suffering, Alexander and Isabella had found their own path. This journey was not easy, but they had walked through it together, overcoming all obstacles, facing the past, and finding a new future. It was an emotional journey, where love was no longer a distant concept, but something real and present in every step they took. Their wedding was not just an event. It was a declaration that love was the only thing that could conquer everything. Alexander had officially proposed to Isabella, but this time, it was no longer a duty or responsibility. It was a choice from the heart. He had found the woman he wanted to spend his life with, the one who had helped him change, the one who had made him realize that happiness was not about what you possess, but about what you share together. That was real love. Not for any other reason, but for the bond and empathy between them. The ceremony took place in a grand and intimate setting at Harrington Mansion, where they had shared so many moments together. The 4 children, the children that Isabella and Alexander had raised together, were the bridesmaids and groomsmen in the wedding. They were living proof of the love they had built, the children Alexander had loved as his own. Their presence in the wedding made the moment even more special, for there was nothing more precious than family. And this family was a clear testament to everything Alexander and Isabella had gone through. Alexander's grandmother stood in a corner of the room, her eyes glowing with happiness and pride. She had not only witnessed Alexander's life change, but she had also been the one to guide the family through difficulties. When everything had settled, she stepped forward, taking both Alexander and Isabella's hands. She looked into their eyes and gently said, "Wealth does not make a family. It is love and sacrifice." Her words were deep, and she was the one who had taught them that love was the solid foundation of a family. She had seen everything they had gone through, and now she could proudly say that the Harrington family had returned with a new strength. When the ceremony ended, Alexander and Isabella stepped out onto the mansion's balcony, where the golden light of the sunset bathed the entire space in a warm hue. The 4 children were still playing in the yard, their laughter echoing throughout the space, creating a perfect picture of a happy family. Alexander looked down and felt his heart beat faster. This was the life he had always dreamed of, not because of money or power, but because of love, because of the bond that he and Isabella had built together. Isabella turned to look at Alexander, her gaze gentle and filled with love. She held his hand, feeling the warmth and peace he brought. "I never thought I would have a family," she said, her voice lowering, but her eyes brightening with joy. Her life had been full of suffering, but now she realized that what she needed had always been there. She just hadn't seen it. Alexander squeezed her hand, his heart overflowing with emotions. He looked into her eyes and whispered, "We will always be together. Forever." His words were not just a promise, they were a statement from the bottom of his heart. They both knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because they had built a family that nothing could break. This scene was not just the end of a story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Their wedding was not just a romantic event, but a testament to a love that had overcome all difficulties, to the resilience and sacrifice they had given each other. In this moment, their family was complete, and the future, no matter what it held, would no longer have anything that could tear them apart. The 4 children, Isabella and Alexander, all looked forward. Their lives were now more complete than ever, because they had found each other, and because they had created a real family, a family built not just with words, but with sincere love and unconditional sacrifice.